I believe it's critical we identify specific learning outcomes that we intentionally design to further learning, to further skill development, and all that are based in that thorough comprehensive needs assessment you got when you got the input of leaders and possibly even participants. Now, in the designing workbook, you can refer to 6 steps for designing workshops. Number 2, develop learning outcomes. You can have something in front of you as I kind of highlight what I think are some of the key outcomes that we might do in a foundational workshop. Mostly, what do you want participants to be able to do differently after the training session? And again, you want to co-create these with whomever asked you to do the session and the leaders of the area. And if you did a survey of participants electronically or in person, you can ask for their input as well. And so there are 2 types of learning outcomes: content, which is probably what you're most familiar with, and process learning outcomes. So the content, that's the what. The major concepts, skills, tools, knowledge, what you want people to know, be able to do. Process learning outcomes is actually the how, the creating of the container, the learning environment so people can achieve the learning outcomes that are more the content. So how do you want participants to engage each other? How do you want them to feel so they accomplish the learning outcomes? And while the content learning outcomes are critical and key, the process learning outcomes, often overlooked, are actually the means to the end of accomplishing those content learning outcomes, those skills, tools, concepts, and they're equally as critical. So I just want to share some principles as you develop content learning outcomes. I encourage you really to research the topic. Research it, read until you feel things are repetitive. You're like, I kind of know that. Doesn't mean you have to know everything, but enough that you're confident and you feel competent to be the source of the learning. Your activities, the source of the learning. I gather some relevant statistics. When I'm working with college campuses, I have some stats I use of the changing demographics of students, which really talk to equity on many levels of difference. When I'm working with organizations that are in the community, corporations, I get stats about employee turnover, retention, the cost of retention, again, changing workforce, which is related to the changing college students, but not totally. And so some of those stats can really help people. Oh, stats also for corporate and other organizations about how much racial harassment, sexual harassment, homophobic harassment, trans harassment is going on nationally, locally, how the increase of those are being reported, sexual harassment. So stats can be very powerful, particularly as we talk in other videos, if the folks are more left-brained, impersonal, more kind of dominant cultures, their motivation. And so statistics, if that's their culture, stats, facts. I also collect up, I want to encourage really common generic examples. This could be the kinds of microaggressions that have been reported before, looking at all the surveys. It could be through all your research. You just get a sense that you have lots of examples and stories you can tell, not your personal stories yet, and not someone who they can figure out who it is story, but generic examples of whatever your topic is that really show the current state, the future state, and what we need to do to get there. And then I want you to collect up lots of your own personal stories from privileged and marginalized identities. And earlier in my career, I would write these down, other generic examples, common ones, as well as my own personal stories, so that they were more in me, in my body, as well as I could glance during a break or if they were in a small group, just to keep them front of mind. I've been doing this for 35 years, so I do have probably 20, 30 stories that I do use pretty often, so they're in me. But to be honest, mostly, I just try to get as present and clear an instrument as I can be. And I'll be talking, and all of a sudden, some thought I haven't had for years will pop in. A story I've never told before will come in. You know, I'll check my body to make sure I'm not working my issues on the group, something that just happened to me personally that I still am all triggered around and doesn't have relevance. But I could have something that just happened that I am still triggered around and has relevance, but I need to be clear and centered enough to differentiate between which stories I'm working on the group and which ones will add value. And so I, these days, trust my intuition. If a story comes in, I do a quick check, I'll tell the story. And what I've learned is I unconsciously can pick up the energy in the room, issues that maybe people haven't talked about, And it could be as I read the room, I'm collecting all this data that consciously I'm not aware of. And these stories will just pop in my mind, and I may not know why I'm telling the story. But as soon as I do, and I say who relates, someone or several people will come in, and it'll be really clear that that type of story needed to be told, either at the depth of honesty and openness or a new topic that got more people in the room. And so trust your intuition that often you will pick up on the unconscious, unspoken issues in the room. But till then, and even if you trust your intuition, do come with a lot written down, just so full breadth of difference, privileged and marginalized, so that you can refer to them throughout. Another step as you're developing content and the learning outcomes is you want to brainstorm a full set of those possible outcomes. What are they? And in a moment, I'll share you a list of, I think, 15. And unless I have a day and a half or 2 days, we often don't get through those. But I do like to remember the full breadth and then choose among them based on the learning needs assessment guidelines that I got from people. So you then want to scaffold them in what I call sequential order. Now, an activity, I want to be really clear, we're not talking activities yet. These are still the outcomes. But a specific activity could help me accomplish several outcomes. And so if you've seen me do a lot of work, you're like, well, she does an activity earlier sometimes than I'm used to. It depends on the group, what their needs are, the current context, and what I'm thinking in the moment. But I do think there is as I mentioned in an earlier video, building blocks, lower risk to high risk. Some skills, knowledge has to be learned before others can be added on. And then prioritize, given how much time you have, given the needs assessment, that can be really helpful. And then you're going to have to edit. Now, not only edit, you have too much. That's what I have to do. But wanting to make sure they're specific and behavioral and even measurable. Now, I don't usually do this, but some organizations may require or want you to, or some units are used to, learn 3 tools to analyze policies and practices with an inclusion lens. Or practice 3 ways to start conversations about diversity in a unit that's not used to talking about diversity. So you can break things down into that specific and measurable. Practice 2 skills to interrupt microaggressions in the moment. Practice 2 skills to go back and start a conversation if you chose not to speak about something that happened in the moment. And some units might want it that specific. And then finally, as you get this kind of more, I'm losing the word, but I'm kind of what you've kind of boiled it down to. The learning outcomes that are attached to the needs assessment, the time you have, the current context. Review those with your contact leaders if you can to confirm that's what they asked you to do. Now what I want to do is share some examples. And again, these are in your packet. So it's a course, again, what we're talking about in this whole 6-month course is foundational sessions, exploring equity, inclusion, social justice, and organization, deepening people's capacity. So there would be very different ones if we were doing a part 2, if we were developing trainers, if we were developing inclusion practitioners, if I was working with leaders around organizational change, if I was just focusing on privilege. And so you need to just shift the learning outcomes depending upon what you're doing. In this course, it's foundational equity, inclusion, social justice. So if I have a day plus, but even if I don't, I want people to know the organization's commitment to equity inclusion. And that's usually the language they use when I'm doing this kind of a workshop. And the opening leaders usually underline that. I'll reference it in my opening. And I want people to understand the organization's expectations. All members help create and maintain an inclusive organization. And again, I want the senior leader talking about that. I'll reinforce it. I really want people getting the leadership case. Some people call it the business case, the why. Why are we doing this? Many participants in workshops I'm in these days say, we've been talking about diversity forever, but when I ask them, okay, take a moment, write down, if you were trying to describe to someone why this organization is committed to equity, inclusion, social justice, and you had to do it in an elevator that was only going up 3 or 4 floors, so you have about 20 seconds, what would you do? So some people call that the elevator speech. You can shift the metaphor. If you know an elevator, you can say the person has an attention span that's probably 15 seconds long. What could you say? And so I'll have people do that, share it, report out, because often people say they know a lot about diversity, but be able to talk about why it's critical in a way that people can understand, that's connected to the interests of the people they're talking to, the organizational goals, that's what's critical. And so to be able to have your leader do that, but also that's one reason I use statistics, or as you get into the lesson plans and the other activities that we'll talk about in the next few weeks. Microaggressions, the gallery of activity, which is what happens in their organization, that can help build the leadership case. Sometimes stats on retention, recruitment, turnover, revolving door, customer complaints, the cost of losing customers, whatever it takes. We want to find out what the leader's self-interest is. It might be reputation, it might be budget, it might be the future of the organization, it may be their legacy, whatever it is. Have that be part of the leadership case. And there's so much now. I mean, 10 years ago, there wasn't as much out on the internet, but there are so many organizations that have a very clear leadership case. Does not mean their organization's inclusive, but at least someone has written the case. You can find many different options that can help you get clearer what that is and then help organizations. Content learning outcomes, clearly, in my belief, range of differences. Most people come in thinking we're only going to talk about race, and with that, only black-white. And while we will talk black-white dynamics and we will talk race in my workshops, I do believe it's critical that in a foundation, strategically, you have people talk about the full breadth of differences. You'll hear me talk about differences that make a difference is what I call it. Any category difference where there's a privilege, unearned advantage, and clearly undeserved marginalization, dismissed, not listened to, kept out. You can use words like discrimination. Depends, I always see what's the language on the website, and I'll use that language. But you'll notice on this page, besides inclusive, I think everything else, maybe leadership case, are very common terms, and even inclusive these days in most organizations would be. So I try not to use too much jargon. I don't use social justice often in the learning outcomes unless that's in the culture and climate, not just the website, but it's what they actually do. Because that language, we defined it later in my workshops, but I usually don't start with that. I'll mention it, but I may not have it written down. We have several more of these. So I want people to engage in authentic, productive dialogue about privileged, marginalized group dynamics. Now, that language may not be common to people, so I will tell a few stories at that point. And to be honest, I'm not sharing this information until after we've done a number of activities. When you mattered and marginalized, sometimes the sustained dialogue, IGO, individual group organization, quick startup activities. So, and maybe even a time they've some socialization stories. So these concepts I've kind of defined indirectly, but I will need to if I do this, but I really want them learning about privilege and marginalization. Common attitudes, stereotypes, behaviors that perpetuate marginalization, exclusion in the organization. That one is similar to the one before. And sometimes I don't get people really identifying the stereotypes, the implicit bias. But depending on your group, it could be really powerful either in socialization or in the microaggression activity to have them identify what are the probable attitudes fueling this and where could these have come from. Another key content come in my workshops, how the dynamics of privilege and marginalizations impact the success of employees. If you're working with K-12 or college, that would be employees and students, and clearly those we serve, the customers. And so having people talk about that and really see that this is the business case, this is the leadership case, this isn't just a nice thing to do, it is critical to our survival. And then identify their own privileged and marginalized group identities. Now, if I only have a half day, we may do this somewhat, but if I have a full day and the group is moderately already competent, then I'll use the group identity cards to actually have them identify what are their privileged, marginalized identity, or a chart, in my packet to do that. So it's one thing to talk about other people. It's another to talk about your own identities and start to tell stories about how you're seen and treated, privileges you get that you hardly think about. Now you'll notice that I don't have a whole one just on what is privilege. I have that more of a part 2, next steps. Privilege is clearly in the work that I do in Foundation, but I really think people have to talk about their marginalization first and really get the breadth of difference and before they can move into looking at privilege fully. But they can be looking at the dynamics of privilege marginalization, how it impacts the success of employees and those we serve, while they're also then talking about their own life experiences. And then it's important, I think people, as I mentioned, recognize and talk about how they get perceived and treated in their privileged and marginalized identities. This really deepens authentic dialogue. It gets it real in the moment. If it's an intact work team and the leader wants it, we can then talk about what really happens in meetings and other places. But if it's a workshop that's open to a full breadth of folks, I don't get that specific. Progress. This one is critical, especially if you're working with top leaders and or diversity committee folk. Too often we are so focused on what has to be done, the gaps, how far we need to go. I think it's critical that people have the capacity to hold both, how far we've come and how far we need to go. And so especially if a group is early in their awareness or you know there's going to be resistance, having this one, recent progress, as a stated outcome could be really useful, because you're asking them to then, what else do we need to do? In the foundations, I found that going in the interpersonal skill development, most people can meet you to say it's wrong that these microaggressions happen. Now, if you're in a university, you might get reactions from people in resistance about we have to have free speech and academic freedom, and you can have both. But to get people to really recognize what are the microaggressions and how to interrupt them and all that skill building. If you just have a workshop on microaggressions, you can take that last bullet and break it down probably into 3 learning outcomes. How do you recognize? How do you interrupt in the moment? And how do you interrupt afterwards? And all kinds of skills you can teach in that. Again, keep breathing. I don't do all these in a day, but I also, when I'm planning, I want to look at a broad, long list and decide, given who's who and what's what, which ones they need. Even in a one day, even if it's just 10 minutes, I do have people begin to look at how do you design and revise programs, policies, systems, procedures with an inclusion social justice lens. And I use the group identity cards with some unemotionally triggering situations to have them practice by group membership, whose needs probably get met, who could attend a meeting at 7 a.m. on a Friday morning, announced the day before, and who could not attend that meeting, whose needs may not be met by decision of some kind. So if that's what you want to do for an hour, then you can scaffold in where they're actually then analyzing policies, programs, systems from their own organization. But in a foundation one day, I just like to dip it in. It's kind of a commercial for part 2. Plus, too many, I think, diversity workshops, A, fall in the trap of only doing knowledge, and B, only stay at the individual interpersonal level. And I at least like to get them thinking about culture, climate with all the microaggressions work, and then systems, policies, practices. Clearly, I believe you have to get them to apply the tools, concepts, insights, skills in their daily responsibilities, have them practice it in the room, and then how can they take it back? Talk about how it can identify ways to continue learning, and that can be the other workshops that are coming up. It could be, they can talk about how to take it back to their teams and do these same activities. And then finally, action planning and next steps. So take a deep breath. I don't do all that in a 7-8 hour workshop, but I have those in the back that I might squeeze something in because the group might be farther along than I think, or I might need to pull stuff back a bit because they're not as far as long as the leaders told me. So I need to be able to do any and all of these in a foundational way. And that's where we'll be headed in, months 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll talk more about that. But before you do, you have to understand and identify what are the process learning outcomes you want. This is, again, how you want them to be. So I encourage you literally to visualize. Imagine a really successful workshop and imagine the participants engaging each other, engaging you. And then imagine how you want them to feel during, what you want them feeling at the end of the workshop, and even a week, 2, 3 later, so they can accomplish those learning content outcomes. And then here are some that are pretty much for all my workshops at the foundational level. I want people to feel connected to other participants, valued, respected, a part of the learning community. And so if you've not yet read the lesson plan from 10 years ago in your packet, and as we keep going, you'll be looking at some webinar work that I do. You'll see that I do a lot of that, create the container for learning, and that's to have people give them the opportunity to feel connected to others, respected part, their voice will be heard. That whole building the container we talked about in one of the last videos, it's really to get them increasingly willing to take risks, be honest, hear different ideas from me, from participants, open to those. And I want them comfortable enough and connected enough to themselves and others that they'll share experiences, stories, thoughts, feelings, slowly moving down from little risk to deeper risk. And I want them to feel challenged and nudged, that's my word for challenged, enough that they're open to new and different perspectives, and they'll try on new skills, they'll try on new perspectives. I'm not trying to change people, their attitudes. I do want the behaviors to change, and I think every work environment has a responsibility, not just a right, a responsibility to have people's behavior aligned with their core values and vision and intentions and strategic plan. But I don't go after people's attitudes. Now, if they change, I want their behaviors to change. I want people, so their process outcomes, willing to engage increasing authentic dialogue across differences, particularly in their privileged identities, but even in their marginalized. Again, these workshops are not about having people in marginalized identities teach people in privileged identities. It's not about they have to share their stories. Again, everybody's telling stories. We're using videos or using other ways to get information in so people don't have to go back and dig up old stories from a marginalized identity. And we want to have authentic dialogue about the current state, the future state, and how we really want to change. I want not only authentic dialogue, but that includes engage in respectful, passionate disagreements, not debates, not interrupting people, not putting people down, which is what we see, I think, on too much the current ways people are engaging, at least in social media and on TVs. But truly, you can have passion, you can have emotion, and you can stay engaged, hear each other, consider each other's perspectives, acknowledge, clarify, all those skills we'll talk about in further months. And I want them energized to create and maintain respectful, inclusive environments now in the room as well as going out. And I want them motivated. I put willing, but I really want them motivated to do their part, to notice disrespectful treatment, speak up, support others, create inclusive practices, policies. So these are the feelings, the kind of engagement I believe we need to have in order for folks to learn and then apply the content outcomes in their environment. Now, these all show up. If you're in a workshop of mine, you'll see them in the learning outcomes. You'll in the content learning outcomes I talk about, you'll see them in the learning guidelines. Even in my welcome and framing, I'm starting to name some of these process outcomes, and possibly if I've been able to coach the senior leader, they're naming some of these as well. Now, if I back up a minute, as you're doing needs assessment, most folks talking to you will only be thinking about content learning outcomes. So you may need to say, how do you want people to feel and engage, and offer a few of these. And they're like, oh yeah, I want those. Or just say, here's what I find people learn best when, and describe some of these process learning outcomes. And that way, the leaders are at least verbally on board with you. What I want to do now is just quickly show you some variations. I just went back over some workshops I've done this year. So this was college faculty. And as you just glance at this, you'll notice many things are similar, but that second bullet, I talk specifically about creating an inclusive classroom from the start. So again, who are your participants? What are their needs? What do they want information and skills around? Often teachers and faculty, whether it's K-12, college, trainers even, they want to know how do you deal with difficult situations in the classroom. So the last one from the bottom, that one's a little different too. And then also I did design and revise. I could have put here curriculum, advising. So fine-tuning the language for the people. I also used to do a lot of work with student leaders. And in this case, these were resident assistants, the RAs on a college campus. Now this was a half day because you notice there aren't that many. But it's still full range of differences, authentic dialogues, inclusion, exclusion, how do you respond? But the last one was one a little different. Next steps, create inclusive communities on your floor, in your hall. So I really wanted to get it very specific for them in their job responsibility. That can increase their desire to pay attention if they know that their leaders are going to be holding them accountable for really applying this information. And the final one I want to show you is I was just with a nonprofit for a day. This is their full, was a foundation, their full group. Authentic dialogue, breadth of differences. So as we get to the fourth one, that's where I added about privilege, marginalization, and intersecting identities impact community members. They were serving folks with marginalization in 4 and 5 intersecting identities sometimes: class, race, geographic region, disability status, refugee, immigration status. Now, not everybody had all of those, and yet those were really some of the hot issues and needs, which is sometimes different than other organizations I get to. So, deep breath. In closing, my hope is you've started to see some of the learning outcomes, content and process you already do or you want to add to your practice as you continue doing. But it's critical that we have clarity and we have clear guidelines, outcomes that are going to guide you to select then the learning activities. Without these learning outcomes, content and process, you'll be like me early on. I was like, ooh, that's a fun activity, a new toy, as opposed to which activity, where in the design really help people accelerate their capacity, their learning. These outcomes keep us on track to meet the expressed needs and also increases the chance of learning in the moment and application later in the workplace. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.